As we move into this next session here, Theology and Science Rightly Balanced, there's a model I want to really kind of, push down a little deeper and kind of unpack a little bit more as we orient our thinking of science and what theology is and how we might situate that. As I get into things like this, it reminds me of being a child and those days of the little golden books. And if you remember the little golden book series and all that they were, this one, as you might guess, I had this book, and it was always fascinating to look through the pictures. My grandmother, for my 5th Christmas, got me a Viewmaster. Now, I had the dinosaur reels, yes. In fact, I started to bring it today. I still have it at the house. So it is archaic. It is an antique now, much like I am. But it's interesting, though, is what fascinated me about the book, the picture, the Viewmaster stuff, is I enjoyed the images of these fascinating beasts. But what I didn't capture then, and now I look back and see, is the narrative that was included with these. If you'll see this opening page from the Little Golden Book, long, long ago, long before the days of men. And so you begin to see these arguments. See, every one of you may be in here just because you're curious. You appreciate what Martha and I do, and you're here to support us, and for that I'm thankful and I appreciate that. But I'm also aware that as I speak to crowds of people, some of you are in here just because you're like, I don't know what to do with dinosaurs. I remember a conference Martha and I went to in Chattanooga several years ago, and I can remember as a lady, she seemed like she was in her 50s, in the back of the room during Q&A time. She said, I don't know what to do with dinosaurs biblically. I've been raised in church, and I don't know what to do with them. And I recognize that permeates so many of our minds. Part of that is because from a child we have been taught these kind of ideas. I like it if the book said, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, which is what we're about to do, is that very thing, is walk through this theologically. But you begin to recognize the tension, because we've been taught how to think like the world, and then when we come to subjects like this that require a theological insight to really flesh it out thoroughly and rightly, we get confused and we shut down. And I run into so many Christians who say, well, God said it and that's good enough. Or, Genesis talks about 6 days and God creating, but I just believe he did it, and however he did it, that's fine. Now, I'm not trying to make these things per se salvation issues, but I want us to be mindful of the potential inconsistencies that we build into our thinking and our theology. Like today, ideas of what to do with a mask, COVID, vaccines. Now, I'm not here to digress into that. I'm not trying to stir that pot per se, but I want you to understand how many of us as people fail to incorporate a theological mindset, an understanding of God and his creation, what's going on here, into things as that. And part of what makes us vulnerable with these things today is because we have this faulty thinking already in place. And so we look to the Bible and say, well, Jesus died on the cross, I believe that, and that's about all I can do with it. Well, there's a whole lot more of the Bible than that. There's a sovereign hand of God that moves throughout the breadth of history. In the beginning, God created. That means that when creation began, God was. That's not a small thing. But if you're going to practice science and dismiss that very idea, your science is going to run in the gutter, and you're always going to fail to come to the right conclusions because you don't have the right starting point. See, in my mind, there is no conflict between science and theology. Theology is more than a study of religions who might have a general concept of God and who he is. Science cannot answer every question in spite of what we're told. Did God use scientific laws to create everything? I'm not asking for you to answer that question out loud, but in your mind, just for a second, did God use scientific laws to create everything? Yeah. Laws, first of all, aren't a thing. It is a descriptive narrative of how things function. And to imply that there is something God used is to bring that thing on par with God. There is no on par with God. He is, and everything flows from him. Everything. We need to anchor that in our thinking. The late Jay Gould, a paleontologist, wrote, "Science studies how the heavens go, and religion how to go to heaven." And again, as I've already been talking, Gould would propose that we need to diverge these two ideas, to separate them. He came up with something called non-overlapping magisteria. He describes it this way, is that science and religion represent two clearly different methods by which humans inquire about the nature of existence. Both are vital to a full understanding, and both can operate only within their non-overlapping realms of inquiry. When conflict between religion and science has occurred, Gould argues it is because either science or religion has inappropriately crossed over its boundary. You hearing what he's saying? When conflict comes, who gets to decide who's right? You know? Gould is saying, let's push these two apart. And I'm sitting here saying to you guys, when science is inappropriately done, conflict is going to arise. When you have questions with your science, we need to be able to have an authority we go back to and filter our science from that very orientation, from that very concept. From which magisteria is Gould arguing this very point? Is he being scientific here, or is he being philosophical here? He's being philosophical here. This is something we've got to catch as well. Stephen Hawking, in the book The Grand Design, says, because there is a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something from rather than nothing. While the universe exists, while we exist, it is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Such a law as gravity. Here is one of the smartest men that have ever worked, and he is being such a sloppy philosopher here. Such a sloppy philosopher, and he's abandoning sound scientific principles. As we just discussed a minute ago, law is just simply a description of a thing that is. Gravity is a thing, but we can only describe it. You know, what is gravity? I mean, your minds are thinking, well, I know how it works, but I don't know what it is. Hawking demonstrates spontaneous creation. Can Hawking demonstrate spontaneous creation? Now think about this. As a scientist, which is the work of observing, testing procedures and observations of the world, what scientific test is Hawking using to demonstrate the spontaneous creation of the world? The answer is there isn't one. There isn't one. Again, he's being philosophical here. This is why we need this anchor point for us as we work through these ideas. Once again, from which magisteria is Hawking arguing from? He's not being a scientist here with all of his intellectual capacities. See, the early scientists, if you will, of several hundred years ago had a different approach to when they saw creation. They saw creation, and when they saw creation, they saw the hand of God. John Ray writes in the title of his book here, "The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of the Creation." Johannes Kepler says, "I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him." Sir Isaac Newton, in his work General Scholium to the Principia, says, though these bodies may indeed continue in their orbits by the mere laws of gravity, yet they could by no means have at first derived the regular position of the orbits themselves from those laws. Thus, this most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. We need scientists who think this way. This is critical for us. That we need to see the hand of God and recognize it and be able to process that as we grow and learn. Theology rightly balanced. First of all, and if you want to write anything down, I'm sorry that I don't have a handout for you today. If you want to write something down, process this. First of all, let me just say this. If there's anything that you have seen today that you want, get with me. I'll get it to you. You can have anything I've got. What I want to walk through is this balanced models. First of all, accept God is the creator, the sustainer, and the end of all things. 2, grasp the historic origin of a thing according to the Bible. How did a thing come to exist? So what I mean by that is if you're going to study the flight patterns of birds as they migrate, that is a study in of itself, and that's a good and just study. But part of your anchoring procedures that you need to do and are important is one is to understand how did birds come to exist in the first place? What intellectual capacities do they have? And how did those come to exist? And did they just figure out migratory patterns, which is really much of what the scientific world would have us to believe? Or is there a hand of God that's at work here guiding these creatures? I don't remember the bird, but it's somewhere out in the Pacific Ocean where the birds will lay their eggs and then leave the babies. And they'll fly like 1,000 miles over the ocean to their summer home, if you will. And so the baby birds are left to, once they develop, to then fly and meet mom and dad at this island. Now, best I can tell, the baby birds have not been left a map or an instruction. There's no guidebook. But yet, somehow, they inherently know where to go and how to get there. That's the hand of God. That's how we practice our science, is being mindful of this. Pursue additional historic information from the Bible. As an example, with the Genesis flood, where did the land come from? In the beginning, God created. Day 3, land masses came to the surface. But we come to Genesis 6 and 7 and we see a flood. This helps flesh out our historic foundation so that we can in turn look at our earth rightly. Practice your science, but be a critical thinker. Keep a good mental filter in place. Build up your mental immune system. I've had people ask me, I'm going to this secular college, I'm being taught evolution, what should I do, how should I respond? First thing is be mindful is most sciences, 95% of what they teach you is observable science, which is going to be sound and trustworthy. But you've got to be able to filter out the other 5%, if you will, to understand where conjecture, opinion, and poor worldview and philosophy is there. You've got to do that really with anything. If you're going to expose yourself to the mainstream media, you've got to be able to filter out the information. And that's part of how we grow and mature as people. Parents, do not just be present while your children are growing up, and I want you to be present, but look to grow them, equip them, teach them, train them, lead them. Be diligent with your children. They need your guidance. Inherently, they're going to see the hand of God to some degree, but you've got to be mindful of the influences that come along. Be invested in their education. Your theology must be the foundation for your scientific pursuits. As I mentioned earlier, Proverbs 1:7, a good way of anchoring our thinking. Colossians 2:8, Paul exhorts the church, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception, according to the traditions of men, according to the elementary principles of the world rather than according to Christ. What does this tell us? The world is going to influence you to believe and think like the world. And that is a dangerous pursuit. Be mindful of these kinds of things. 2 Peter unpacks some interesting conversations here. He's been dealing with what he describes as scoffers. He says, first of all, know this, that in the last days, mockers will come with their mocking, following after their own lust and saying, where's the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. For when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water. He's talking about the land mass, and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. And so he's referencing two monumental moments in the history of humanity, which both have some interesting geological implications to them. First of all, he takes us back to Genesis chapter 1, where we read, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. And then God said in verse 9, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the land, dry land, earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And so what Peter's doing is he's referencing back to this particular moment. And then in his very next breath almost, he says in Genesis 7:11, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of heaven were opened. It's interesting that Peter in his time is making some correlations to what he sees as very important moments then. And I see this very same thing happening today. So much of what earth science is about is to minimize the impact of the Genesis flood, but it also does so with a cloak of time. Now, I've intentionally am not going to try to get into discussing time, but just in case there's any questions, I'm what you would call a young earth creationist. I open up Scripture, work to interpret the genealogies of chapter 5, Genesis 5 and 11, and work to understand them as a general adding up of the generations, and we can begin to interpret some other historic moments. And basically, I would say we're looking at about 6,020 years from creation. That's how I interpret that. Now, what becomes important here is to recognize that the flood itself creates a shift in the world that is really quite profound, of which the secular world takes what the flood does and stretches it out into many small events, many M-I-N-I and M-A-N-Y, over a longer period of time, and it actually kind of cloaks the whole thing. It's this idea that if you give enough time, anything can happen. It's the let's keep it mysterious and the people will believe it. But that minimizes this one key event for us. So I just want you to understand what he's anchoring here. So as we build, and I'm going to work dinosaurs here, so we're not just, but we're going to use that as kind of our vehicle here, but I want you to understand what's going on here in creation. We've got two levels of life and its distinction, how it is being created here in Genesis chapter 1. First of all, we see that there's a description on a general sense that Genesis on day 5, God creates the great sea creatures and the flyers. We don't get very specific detail here, but we have a really general sense that that life that existed in the ocean and that life that it spends its time flying in the air was created on this day. The very next day, we see the land animals. It uses the word livestock or cattle, creeping things, and even humanity is created on this day. And we see that general level of description. So when were the dinosaurs created? Is anybody ever, you wondering about that? Well, let's walk through this logical flow. First of all, Dinosaurs are land animals. Now, I'm aware that there are some unique marine reptiles and some unique flying reptiles. But in the strictest classification, dinosaurs are land animals. Okay? Now, land animals were created on day 6. Okay? We're just using the Bible as our guide here. So therefore, dinosaurs would have been created on day... You all are good. Y'all are good. Let's take that one step further. Man was created on day 6. Therefore, dinosaurs and man lived together. Now, I'll assure you, and I am well aware that that is not a popular idea, nor is that a mainstream idea. And I could be called a religious fundamentalist for holding to such a view in the scientific community. But I'm not here to hold to any particular worldview other than God's. And what happens here is this sets my foundational thinking. This gives me a historic framework. Now I can begin to look at the ground. I can begin to look at the fossils and begin to interpret them in light of this historic foundation. To move on to the next level of distinction, as you see in green here, after its kind. The word is created kind. You'll see the idea of what's called a baramin, which is 2 Hebrew words put together. Bara, created, men is kind. And the Genesis 1 uses this phrasing throughout to describe how life was brought into existence. And I believe this gives us another level of distinction. It's not giving us a great depth of detail, but it does bring us a little deeper. This is a phylogenetic tree right here. It's a very simple one. It comes in all kinds of forms. The general idea from a secular idea is this is meant to show common ancestry. So as you see the line here at the bottom, basically what they're not showing you is there's some common ancestor down here, and as time progresses, which is kind of the vertical idea, there's going to be a split, and a split, and a split, and so on and so forth, and everything here has evolved from something down here. Anytime you see this kind of phylogenetic tree, the thing you're always going to have missing are the splits. These are called missing links. They're missing for a really, really good reason, because they do not exist. In fact, I have read some evolutionary guys don't even know what a missing link should look like. What does it look like for a life to transition from one to another, for it to split? They don't have a description, because what we see amongst the entirety of life is it does do what it's supposed to do. It has complexity, it has function, it looks like it is existing as it was intended to exist. So what I like to do with this is just point that out, but also these creatures up here at the top, we have fossil evidence of them. I wouldn't dispute that they were alive in some form. Now, you'll see this word like Sauropoda. That's a general classification of a group of animals that do have some diversity. So how would I shift this thinking? I would just cut off the top of them, and instead of having one phylogenetic tree, I would have a forest of phylogenetic trees. Now what we're doing here, there's the red line. That's the same red line we've clipped off. This red line is creation. So when God created after his life, let's take the dog kind, the original basal kind of dog would have had a particular appearance. We would have recognized it as such. And genetically within it, it would have had a broad genetic range of information that could be expressed in different ways. And so that's what you see is over time, there would be some genetic variation, but it would retain its innate dogness. The blue line becomes the Genesis flood. And as we'll see in just a minute, God told Noah that 2 of each kind, same word, are going to come onto the ark. That doesn't mean that every possible variation of species existed. Nor should we look back and say, well, there's too many dogs today and God had to have taken all of them. That's not what's being taught here. That's not the implication. That there would have been a kind that would have represented the original kind, and that kind would have come off the ark and diversified into the various species, not kinds. No overlap. Dogs did not come from something else, and dogs are not becoming something else. You look at the cats here. They retain a level of catness. It doesn't matter how big or small they are. It doesn't matter if they have long canines, short tails, stripes, flat ears, long bodies, thick fur. You look at them and you can what? You can see that innate catness in them. Whales would have the same thing. Penguins are kind of cool. And you can see the variation in how they're genetically expressed. Sometimes that can be pushed by the environmental conditions. It's like with a dog. Dogs are most likely to survive with short hair in hot climates. Therefore, God has built within how they exist that capacity to do that. You get into a cold climate, the thicker haired dogs are going to exist. You see that even within the elephant kind. So when we press into this, we look at the dinosaurs. This is this sauropods. This is probably a division within the sauropods of the brachiosaurs, which are the longer four-armed, as opposed to the. This would be the sauropod you see in general. It has the long neck, long tail, but the four legs are a little bit longer, and it's going to have a little bit more of a upward posture, whereas opposed to the apatosaur kind, it's going to be a little bit more horizontal in its overall posture. But both of these I would call the sauropod kind. And so you're going to see that same idea of genetic variation. The ankylosaurs would have the same thing. Triceratops within their skulls are going to have a lot of diversity. But something happened along the way as we see this creation, and we see that Adam and Eve are in the garden. And it says here in Genesis chapter 2 that God says, if you eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will what? Now, we see in chapter 3, they ate. And did they die? But spiritually, they died instantly. It says here that the eyes of both of them were open and they knew. And I think that's what was being communicated here. Physically, no, you're right. They did not die instantly, but they begin the process. But that's what happened to humans. But we see that the ground is cursed here. The animals are cursed. Something just changed. See, at the end of Genesis chapter 1, it says that the fruits, the vegetables, will be the food for all living beings, for all animals, for all life. And yet we see, as I mentioned with the vertebra earlier, with the bite marks in it, clearly something changed. I don't know the particulars, the exact details, but all of a sudden, dinosaurs are now interested in other dinosaurs as dinner. And I would imagine that once they got that taste of blood, that they liked it. And I would see them pushing deeper into that. And so as they begin to have offspring, that becomes the means by which they find their food. Now this is a very important implication because we have animals that are dead over here, and we are asking the question, at least in the background, we're going to ask the question, why are they dead? That's to me is part of how I want to process this information. As we move into Genesis chapter 6, we see God describing to Noah, he said, the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and I will blot him out. Move down a few more verses. I'm about to destroy them with the earth. It's an interesting phrase, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. There's two ways, to me, you could almost take that. I'm going to destroy humanity, and I'm going to do so by using the earth to accomplish that, which we know happened. But we also could say, I'm going to destroy them with the earth. So in conjunction with, what we've got to kind of remember here is at least what we see in the destruction of the earth, how it functions, is a direct result of God judging the sin of humanity. And so the implications of that are, as we struggle with crops, as we struggle with famine, drought, things of this nature, these are reminders of my sin. In fact, if I could just digress in here just for a moment, there was the very first year we dug, 2011. I was familiar with creation apologetics, but it resonated in a new way with me at that time. I've termed it windows and mirrors. Because on the first day, I was kind of impressed by the idea of almost looking through a window into the distant past, to whatever extent you might want to argue that. And I was fascinated by that. And then the next day, it really began to dawn on me that what I was looking at was a mirror. The realities of what I was digging in were reminding me that I sin and that God does judge sin. Now, church, you know this. We have hope in Christ and in Christ alone. And so that is why we have joy and peace in who we are, and we look forward to the new heavens and the new earth, which won't have a fossil record in it. You know what? We won't be reminded of death. But until then, the ground we walk upon is a graveyard. And I think that's why the world and so much of the geology, the paleontology, the biology, the sciences want to interpret the world in such a unique way, such a distorted way from Scripture, because they don't want to be reminded of what the earth is screaming at them. God does judge sin. To push on a little deeper here, Romans 8 reminds us, for we know the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain. We see that in our world. We feel that. Wickedness in full swing. We're coming to the ark now. Noah has received instructions from God about taking 2 of every kind onto the ark. So how do we know dinosaurs were on the ark? Because I am a firm believer dinosaurs were on the ark. Now, I would love to have one alive today. A few things to think about. First of all, is they were part of the original created kind. And while we have a tendency to really pull them and isolate them out of every other thing, they were part of God's original creation. And I think by implication, God instructed Noah to build an ark to preserve the created kind. And to me, that seems a logical connection that he would include the dinosaurs in that procedure. It's estimated that the ark would only need to hold about 16,000 animals. Now, that's a lot of animals. But so much of the arguments that I've heard through the years is the ark just wasn't big enough to hold all the life that was needed to be represented here. But as we talked about with the kinds and the specific kinds God would have created or would have called, you would not have needed to be representing every unique species of dogs on the ark. And so God just promises to preserve the kinds, and then genetically he would express it from there. The average size of a dinosaur is about the sheep to cow range. But that still answers the question is, so what do you do with the really, really big ones, right? How do you get them in the door? Babies, I think you're probably looking at more than likely sub-adults, teenagers. Now, reptiles grow throughout their whole life, and we think of dinosaurs in that same vein. And so if you just simply don't get the oldest, biggest dinosaurs, but you get those that are more ready to reproduce once they come off the ark, instead of getting a 50-foot T-Rex, you are taking a 20 or 25-foot T-Rex. Now, you still got to pin him up, but you also think about things like with animal behavior, like hibernation. Could it be that hibernation was a thing that started here at the ark? And I think it's a plausible idea is that these animals would have gone and just settled down. Because we're talking about a supernatural work here. The Bible doesn't tell us that Noah went around the earth gathering two of every kind. And so the implication here is there's a supernatural work of God even moving the animals to Noah. And so I would say that would continue even within the ark itself. The Chinese culture and other non-biblical sources, there are a plethora of sources that are not biblical that make descriptions of people encountering animals. And as we look at the general description of those animals, those descriptions oddly fit what we think of dinosaurs. And then further, there's artwork all over the planet that represents creatures that, again, look like dinosaurs. And as an example here, the Carlisle Cathedral, Bishop Richard Bell. He's buried in the church, in the floor. His spot is marked, and there's some brass rings around where he's marked, and you see the impressions in the brass rings. It's my understanding that is present there at this very moment today. And you see this long-necked creature in the brass. You go to the Ta Prohm Buddhist temple in Cambodia. You walk through the complex. It's abandoned, been apparently abandoned for a long time. I think it's more of a tourist stop these days. Many columns throughout the complex, animals carved in, and then you've got this one guy carved in. He looks like a stegosaur, the back plates. Now, you make the argument, okay, these people are finding the bones and reconstructing them, but that's really not what's being depicted in the artwork. They're depicting what seems to be an interaction. They seem to be creating creatures that they saw alive and walking around. As we move into the flood itself, the fountains of the great deep burst open and the floodgates of the sky opened up. And so what you have, to me, are two things. Now, I am not going to go really deep with the geology because I hope to do another one of these next fall. And I'm going to change the theme, and I would like to do a geology theme next year and press in, because this is my goal, is to take this idea of science and theology and deal with 3 or 4 subjects over the coming years so that we can have and press in on these ideas and be able to get some really good answers. Geologically, we see the face of the planet changing. The waters prevailed and increased. The high mountains and the whole heaven were covered to a depth of, 5 cubits? 15 cubits. And all flesh died. We have a historic account of an event that changed the face of the planet. Is there evidence within the rock record? Well, first of all, I would say is that fossils are one of the chief things. We have fossil all over the planet, literally. It is estimated that 95% of the fossils that are on the planet are marine fossils. And 100% of those marine fossils are found on dry land. That sounds suspiciously like water on top of dry land. Now, I realize that geologists will have a response to that. Typically, what they see is a series of 7 to 8 transgression and regression phases. I would simply interpret that same piece of information as the mechanics of the flood, not slow, gradual processes over millions of years. This is a chart that I found really helpful and interesting here. What you see is, as we have the beginning of the flood here, it says it rained for 40 days, 40 nights, and then the waters continued to prevail. And so you see kind of in a graph that the flood waters would have continued to intensify. And those things that were happening, I believe that what we're looking at is there was an event under the earth's crust that begin to break through. I believe as much as anything, we're seeing the initial triggering of molten rock breaking through the crust. We also are seeing the work of tidal waves washing onto the earth. If you've got molten rock hitting water, it's going to superheat the water and shoot fountains of steam into the atmosphere. I'm not sure how much really fell from the skies and how much was shot into the skies and cooled and returned back to the earth as rain. In either case, you have got an incredible shift in what's going on, both geologically and hydrologically, and the planet is being inundated. And you see this going on. And then it says at day 150, that which was happening under the earth, under the waters, that was stirring all this agitation, God's shut it down. The energy begins to abate, and we eventually see the floodwaters beginning to run off. I'm going to talk more detail about this. You're going to have to wait till next year for a little bit more detail. But I will note this right here, mountaintops. This to me is not pre-flood mountains. Mount Everest did not exist pre-flood. The Himalayas did not exist pre-flood. What we're talking about here is, I believe this is a volcanic feature. Mountains form either through collisions of two continental plates, like the Himalayas. It is the Indian plate. It comes up from the south and hits the Asian plate and creates a buckling and uplift. We'll also see where the Rocky Mountains appears to be the formation of what we call subduction out in the ocean, where you would have ocean crust would drop and fracture and drive itself under the west coast of North America and South America. And what that creates is heat, and it eventually will bubble up in the formation of volcanic mountains. If you're familiar with the Cascade Mountains right along the coast, those are all volcanic. In fact, the oceans that are so beautiful in Oregon, those coastlines are so beautiful, that's all basalt, which is volcanic material. And that would have worked its way and kind of kicked up the whole entire Rocky Mountain chain. And so you see, this is what I believe we're seeing addressed here at this phase, until eventually the waters abated enough for Noah to leave the ark. Now, this doesn't mean that now everything's dried out and everything's good to go. It doesn't mean there isn't still water on the earth. It means this was the point at which it was sufficient for Noah in this location to begin to move back out into the earth itself. The drying out process and all that went on here would have taken years and years and years, and in many respects would still even remain today. The flood itself, a global catastrophe. We're talking about rapid burial. We're talking about life being fossilized quickly. This is a plate fish here that was found in 1952. This is the actual fossil now that's excavated. And what's intriguing about it is you have this fish, but you have within it a second fish. The idea here, the thinking here is that the big fish swallowed the little fish and they were both buried. Now, with this process, you can't have vast amounts of time or you would expect a level of decay and deterioration. This is an indicator of rapid burial. These two fish were caught in this moment and were crushed and killed and drowned in this moment. This is a nodosaur that was found up in Canada just a few years ago. What I find intriguing about it is the level of preservation. Now this is not skin in that it is literally his original skin. It's fossilized, but the level of preservation, trust me, if we found something like this, you would know about it right away, okay? Because this is extremely unique, but you can see the details of his skull. His eye socket would be right here. You can see the dermal bones here that's sticking out, and there's another image of it, and this is the general idea of what would have been preserved. Again, this points to rapid burial and preservation. Now, I think it was 2015 or 16, Martha and I found an intriguing bone. I will tell you, I don't know still to this day exactly what it is. What catches your eye? You see the pattern on it? What was interesting is it's hollow on the inside. Martha started to work on it when she brought it in the lab. She said, this thing is empty in here. And I don't remember why you decided to stop working on it. But you put a dental pick in my hand and I will scrape on anything. She actually has to tell me to not prep bones, because sometimes she'll say, what do you think? And I'll just start scratching on it with my fingernail just because I'm just used to doing it. So I took my dental pick out, and I think this little patch right here is probably me scraping on it, to be honest with you. But I looked at it and I said, wait a second. It's crumbling off, but that's not just dirt crumbling off. So we talked about it, and what we have when we send it off to another guy is this is dinosaur skin. Again, we're seeing these examples of rapid burial, of preservation. You can see the interlocking pattern. This is from Dr. Marcus Ross, a paleontologist. It says this is dinosaur skin, the hexagonal, pentagonal structure of the non-overlapping scales. It's a match for dinosaur skin. It's intriguing. We're still pondering this idea. But what I want you to hear is the fossil record is telling a different story than a lot of what we've been told through the years. It really is. You were asking about soft tissue earlier. This is Dr. Mary Schweitzer had gotten a few pieces of a tyrannosaur femur bone, and she put the bone into some acid. The acid is designed to dissolve away the bone itself, and what was left was some material that she wound up putting under a microscope. And these are the images, some of the images that what she found. It's intriguing. You can go on to 60 Minutes and see the video where she takes a blood vessel. You can see the branching blood vessel. And she takes little tools and she pulls it apart and lets it go, and it returns. Blood vessels, red blood cells, osteocytes, bone cells, collagen, not fossilized. As I said earlier in the previous session, to me these suggest an entirely different time frame than what we've been told. Now you get these interpreted much differently, but they're not being honest with what they're seeing. They're not being scientific, as we talked about earlier. They're being philosophical. She goes on to say, I'm quite aware that according to conventional wisdom and models of fossilization, these structures aren't supposed to be there. But there they are. And I was pretty shocked. The interview with 60 Minutes, she has Jack Horner, the famed paleontologist and consultant in all the Jurassic Park movies. And he was asked the same question, what were your thoughts when you saw this? And he says, I was shocked. I like to ask the question, why was Jack Horner shocked that soft tissue was in dinosaur bones? Because he knew they weren't supposed to be there. Because according to his paradigm, that stuff doesn't preserve. He knew that. That was his initial response. And we need to be mindful of that. Carbon-14 is another thing that's intriguing. Carbon-14 is a process by which living organisms, we're taking it in, it's breaking down. And when an organism dies, stop taking in carbon-14 and it begins to break down. It has a half-life of 5,730 years. And so basically, as you begin to measure the amount of C14 in like a dinosaur bone, you begin to trace and use mathematical calculations, and the general thinking is anywhere between 50, 100,000 years at tops, there should be no traceable amounts of carbon-14 within a dinosaur bone. Zero. Now, dinosaurs to a secular time frame are 65 million years old. They've been dead that long. So if I were to test a dinosaur bone in a lab for carbon-14, and that dinosaur bone were to actually be 65 million years old, how much carbon-14 should I find if it zeroes out? 0. Is it even close? It's not even close. We've got 3 bones within our own collection we've sent off to labs. You have to be a little bit covert. You can't tell them what they have. Somehow that influences what kind of results they give you. I've even read an article subsequent since then that talks about that the secular paleontologists say, beware of the Christians, the creationists, when they send things in. So it's almost like they're, filtering things out. But we've got 3 bones in our collection. All have been dated. All have had traceable amounts of carbon-14 in it. Now, I'm not suggesting that those time frames are accurate, because that kind of process is very subjective, and I'm not going to chase that for us today. But the mere presence of carbon-14 in a dinosaur bone suggests, once again, that that bone is not 65 million years old. In fact, it doesn't just suggest it, does it? It demands it. So is there any evidence that dinosaurs are younger than 65 million years old? Yes, there are. The other, this was an intriguing one right here. You've probably seen dinosaur fossils where they do this here with their backs arched. Initially, it was, I heard it called post-mortem contraction. So after an animal dies, its head swings back over its back, and its tail does the same thing. But why does it do that? There was, I think it was a university in Utah did a study with chickens. And so they were trying to figure out what to do. Now, these chickens were already dead, so they weren't subjected to additional death. They were just dead already. And they wanted to know what would happen. So they put the chickens out. See, I've got that here. They put the chickens out, and they decayed. They just put them on the ground, and they decayed without contorting. So they did not do that arch. But when 7 other chickens were placed in cool, fresh water, their necks arched and their heads were thrown back within seconds. So when you see this dinosaur, what is that suggesting to you? Water. And so these are pieces of information that we bring together for a larger argument. Any one piece of information, I realize, is easily dismissed. But when you start putting these together and you start adding the whole consequence, and then you say, here's the Bible's history, and is there any evidence for what this history says? I'm saying there's a plethora of evidence for a global flood. And here's another piece of information with life buried. As I mentioned with the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, this was just sonar technology dealing with looking at the ocean floor. And there's a splitting of the continents. The mid-Atlantic ridge has been discovered through ocean floor mapping. As you can see, the mid-Atlantic ridge here mirrors the continents on either side. And so the belief here is that this was one landmass. When the fountains of the great deep burst forth, it would have fractured through and pushed the land masses apart from one another. Again, it's a piece of information, but it works. It supports the argument and the narrative of the flood itself. And so just kind of a general idea here, the flood model. I put this here so you can get a sense of the intensity of what's going on here, because the flood would have impacted literally everything. Mountains thrust up, volcanic activity continued, air-breathing life extinguished, the entire earth is saturated with moisture, ocean temperatures rising by as much as 50 degrees, violent weather patterns would continue, ash clouds forming to block out the sun, cooling the air temperature, ocean levels dropping, creating land bridges for migration. What we're seeing is the flood then would trigger the Ice Age. And you have the right conditions, because the Ice Age needs, in order for it to exist, you need certain things to be in place. And the flood would have brought that sufficient mechanism for us into place. And so I see things like this, and I think this is an intriguing idea here when we look at mountain ranges that bear the scars of glaciers moving through. We know the Ice Age existed. We can interpret that from the geological evidence. We ask the questions, how did it happen? And the flood works as a solid model for that. Somebody gets a little winded sometimes when they're talking, don't they? We're coming up on 11 o'clock. Why don't we take about a 5-minute break, and we'll come back for the last session, and then I'll be here to answer as many questions at the end as you would like to ask, okay? So 5 minutes, and then we'll come right back.